The bishops left Nicaea in the late summer of the year 325 with copies of the new creed carefully packed in their saddlebags, with confidence that the great theological crisis of their entire generation had finally been resolved by the gathered church under the patronage of a Christian emperor. They were wrong. The story we tell about Nicaea in popular Christian narratives and even in many seminary textbooks treats the council as the decisive endpoint of the Arian controversy. Nicaea defined the faith, Constantine enforced the result, and Christian orthodoxy moved on to the next set of problems. The actual historical reality is almost the opposite of this neat narrative. The Council of Nicaea didn't end the Arian controversy. It barely paused it. Within just 5 years of the council closing, the Arian party was politically ascendant again at the imperial court. Within 10 years, the great Athanasius of Alexandria, who had been the brilliant young deacon at the council, was an exiled fugitive being hunted by imperial troops along the Nile. Within 20 years, the Roman Empire's emperor was openly sponsoring Arian theology against the original Nicene formula. Within 30 years, in the famous later phrase of the Latin scholar Jerome, looking back at this period in horror, the whole world groaned and found itself, to its astonishment, Arian. The decisive vindication of Nicaea would not finally come until the year 381, 56 full years after the original council, at a different council, in a different city, under a different emperor, after the slow and patient theological work of an entire new generation of bishops who had not been at Nicaea themselves. Today, in this 7th episode of our series on the Council of Nicaea, we are going to walk carefully through that long after history, the difficult decades when the Nicene faith almost did not survive at all, and ask how, against the political odds, it eventually did. The first reversal came astonishingly quickly. By the year 327, just 2 years after the council closed, the Emperor Constantine had begun to receive private petitions from Eusebius of Nicaea, now restored to imperial favor through his court connections via Constantine's sister Constantia, requesting the recall of Arius from his exile in Illyricum. Constantine, characteristically more concerned with unity than with theological precision, agreed. Arius was summoned back to a kind of theological retrial under the emperor's personal supervision around 327 or 328. Arius presented a carefully worded statement of his belief that avoided the specific phrases Nicaea had explicitly condemned, while still preserving the substance of his original position. Constantine declared himself satisfied with the statement and ordered Arius restored to communion across the empire. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, however, refused absolutely to readmit Arius to the Alexandrian Church, citing the standing decision of the council. Alexander died in 328 still refusing, and his successor as Bishop of Alexandria was the young Athanasius, now around 30 years old, who was even less inclined to compromise on the Nicene formula than his master had been. The stage was now set for a direct confrontation between the determined new Bishop of Alexandria and an emperor whose theological convictions were drifting away from the council he had himself convened only 3 years earlier. The Eusebian party, as the now resurgent supporters of the original Arian position came to be called after their political leader, Eusebius of Nicaea, were politically brilliant in a way that Athanasius and the strict Nicenes were not. Rather than challenge the council directly on theological grounds, which was politically dangerous, they used administrative and ecclesiastical procedures to attack the persons of the Nicene leaders with Athanasius first and foremost. Charges were brought against Athanasius systematically over the next several years. He was accused of imposing illegal taxes on Egyptian Christians for the bishop's own benefit. He was accused of murder, though the alleged victim was later produced alive at a synod. He was accused of magic and sorcery, of bribery, of obstructing imperial grain shipments to the new capital at Constantinople, of using personal violence against opponents. Council after council in the late 330s, packed with Eusebian sympathizers, found him guilty of one charge after another. In 335, the carefully orchestrated Council of Tyre formally deposed him from his see. Constantine, exhausted by the constant administrative complaints flowing from Egypt, exiled Athanasius to the imperial city of Trier in Gaul, in what is now Western Germany, far from his diocese. The young bishop was 37 years old when he began the first of his 5 separate exiles. He would eventually spend, in total, 17 of the next 45 years of his life outside Alexandria, either in hiding among the desert monks, on the run from imperial troops, or in formal exile in foreign cities. Constantine himself died in May of the year 337 at his imperial villa near Nicaea, baptized at the very end of his life by, ironically, Eusebius of Nicaea, the lifelong defender of Arius. The throne passed to Constantine's 3 surviving sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II, who divided the empire between them and immediately began to disagree with each other about ecclesiastical policy. The Latin West, under Constans, leaned strongly toward the Nicene formula. The Greek East, under Constantius II, leaned increasingly toward various subordinationist alternatives that softened or rejected the word homoousios. After Constans died in 350 in a coup, and Constantius II became sole emperor of the entire Roman world by the year 353, the imperial weight of the Eastern court fell decisively against Nicaea. Constantius was a personally sincere Christian and a serious patron of the Church, but his theological convictions, shaped by his Eastern advisers, including the surviving Eusebians, were essentially that the Son was similar to the Father, homoios, but not of the same substance, homoousios. He used the full machinery of the imperial state for the next 8 years to try to remove the Nicene formula from the Church and replace it with a softer creed that would unite East and West on his preferred theological terms. The high watermark of Arian political success came in the year 357 with the so-called Second Council of Sirmium, in what is now Serbia. This council, presided over by Constantius II's selected bishops, issued a creed that explicitly forbade the use of both homoousios and homoiousios, dismissing both as unscriptural words that should never have been introduced into Christian theology in the first place. The aged Hosius of Cordoba, the same Spanish bishop who had advised the Emperor Constantine to introduce homoousios at Nicaea 32 years earlier, now over 100 years old and frail, was held under house arrest by imperial agents and pressured for months into signing the new Sirmium formula. He signed under duress and died shortly afterward. Pope Liberius of Rome was also pressured into signing a softened formula under explicit threat of exile and confiscation, though he later repudiated his own signature when he was free to do so. The Latin scholar Jerome, looking back at this dark moment from his late 4th century vantage point in Palestine, wrote the famous and devastating Latin line in his dialogue against the Luciferians: Ingemuit totus, orbis et Arianum, se esse miratus est. The whole world groaned, and was astonished to find itself Arian. The phrase has echoed ever since as the standard summary of how close the Nicene faith actually came in those years to being formally lost forever. But the Nicene faith did not, in the end, die. It survived first through the absolute personal stubbornness and theological brilliance of Athanasius of Alexandria. From his various exiles, first in Tyre, then in Rome, then later in the Egyptian desert, hidden among the Coptic monks who loved him and protected him from imperial soldiers, Athanasius wrote treatise after treatise, defending the Nicene formula in great detail. His orations against the Arians, his defense work, the Apologia Secunda, his late work on the synods, systematically refuting every Arian and semi-Arian formula then in circulation, became the standard textbook of Nicene theology for the entire next generation. He was attacked in synod after synod, deposed officially 5 times by different ecclesiastical assemblies, hunted by imperial troops who once nearly captured him on the Nile during a covert escape, sheltered by Coptic monks who hid him in caves in the desert south of Alexandria. He simply refused to surrender the word homoousios. When his enemies offered him compromise formulas in exchange for restoration to his see, he refused. When his enemies offered him reconciliation with the emperor, if he would just sign a softened creed, he refused. He outlived 3 Arian emperors. He outlived Eusebius of Nicaea. He outlived almost every other major figure of the original controversy. And by the time he died in 373 in Alexandria, restored to his see and to peace at last, the political wind in the Eastern Church was finally beginning to turn. The decisive turning came through a new generation of theologians who had not personally been at Nicaea. The 3 great Cappadocian fathers, Basil of Caesarea, his close friend Gregory of Nazianzus, and his younger brother Gregory of Nyssa, all born in the 320s and 330s in the Roman province of Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey, came to theological maturity in the 360s and 370s. They were of a different generation entirely from Athanasius. They had not personally experienced the original council, but they understood, perhaps more deeply than Athanasius himself had, what the Nicene formula needed in order to be received finally and fully by the broader Eastern Church. They worked out, in technical philosophical detail across many treatises, how the doctrine of the Trinity could be precisely stated in such a way that it preserved both the genuine distinctness of the 3 persons, hypostases in their preferred Greek term, and the absolute unity of the one divine being, ousia. Their formula, 3 hypostases in one ousia, became the standard theological vocabulary of Orthodox Trinitarian theology from then on. They also extended the original Nicene work on the Son to develop a full doctrine of the Holy Spirit, defending the divinity of the Spirit against a new group of 4th century opponents called the pneumatomachoi, the Spirit fighters, who accepted the Son's divinity but denied the Spirit's. The political vindication, when it finally came under a new emperor. Theodosius I, a Spanish-born Roman military commander, became emperor of the East in 379 and was a deeply committed Nicene Christian by personal conviction. Within months of his accession, he issued the famous edict Cunctus Populos in February of 380, declaring that all peoples of the empire should follow the religion of the Nicene Christianity confessed by Bishop Damasus of Rome and Bishop Peter of Alexandria. In 381 he convened the Second Ecumenical Council at Constantinople, which formally reaffirmed and slightly expanded the original Nicene Creed of 325 into the longer Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed that we still recite in liturgy today. The Council of Constantinople removed the original explicit anathemas, added a fuller statement on the Holy Spirit, drawing on the work of the Cappadocians, and addressed several other minor theological matters of the day. Most importantly, it represented the Eastern Church's mature, fully digested acceptance of what Nicaea had originally decided 56 years earlier. The Arian party was formally condemned by canon law and progressively eliminated from positions of ecclesiastical influence within the empire. Arianism survived for several more centuries among the Germanic tribes who had been converted to Christianity by Arian missionaries before the Constantinopolitan settlement, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, but inside the Roman Christian world it was, by the year 400, a dead theology. So how did Nicaea actually win in the end? Not through imperial decree, despite Theodosius. Imperial decrees had been working against Nicaea for most of the previous 50 years, with greater consistency than they had ever worked for it. Not through the original conciliar authority of the council itself, since the council's decisions had been openly disputed and politically reversed within 5 years of its original closing. The Nicene faith survived and eventually triumphed through 3 factors working together over the long span of 2 generations. First, through the absolute personal witness of Athanasius and a handful of other bishops who refused, across decades and across continents, to surrender what they believed to be the apostolic faith they had inherited. Second, through the slow technical theological work of the next generation, the Cappadocian fathers especially, who translated Nicaea into a philosophical vocabulary the broader church could finally receive without confusion. And third, through the conviction, which gradually settled across the Eastern Church through pastoral experience, that the Arian alternatives, despite their political and intellectual advantages in the short run, simply didn't preserve the gospel that the Church actually worshipped. The Nicene formula won, in the end, because in the long pastoral and theological work of 2 full generations, it turned out to say what Christian worship actually meant. The next and final episode of our series will draw together what Nicaea ultimately means for us today, 17 centuries after that summer in Bithynia, for the believer who recites the Creed each Sunday in church. But the question to sit with before we get there is this. If the Nicene faith was nearly extinguished in the 50 years immediately after the council that produced it, what does that say about how the Holy Spirit actually leads the Christian Church through history?